Okay, well, we'll get started right at 12 p.m. on the dot. So I just looked, we actually did this training not too long ago. I think in February was the last time we did it. But we're adding an element here, kind of doing a refresher on the multiple counteroffer. This is in conjunction with the GMAR Addendum AC. And again, the GMAR Addendum AC is that additional contingencies addendum that the GMAR created, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, um, to kind of help us keep with consistent language. So prior to the adoption of this, there's a lot of varying different language out there. So this was just created for us to make sure that there was consistency with the language, that we were all on the same page using the same language. Because again, there's a lot of different versions out there between the inspection contingency threshold, appraisal gap language, and the escalation clause. So just like a one-stop shop for us now. So it is an optional use, obviously. So if you, again, the idea with this addendum is that we're using this as an expansion of these contingencies in competitive offer writing. So, you may not be in that situation where you're not writing competitively. Again, so then it's an optional use. You are not required to use it. And I'll make that distinction with the Addendum A, where we want you guys to still use the Addendum A, even if you're not using like a testing contingency, etc. So optional use. Um, and then before we get into it, we just also want to like make some more comments about it. There's always going to be a slight difference of opinion on interpretation. This is not any different than any contract that we have. So, we just want to like set the stage, kind of warn you guys, when you're, especially with the escalation clause, for example, and we ran into something with the inspection threshold not too long ago. We're obviously, people are going to interpret these things differently. So that's where I'll say, like, you'll come to Joan, Kimmy, Andrew, and I if there are questions. So consultations with lenders, we'll get into this a little bit more and highlight this more, but especially with the appraisal gap, there might be other parties involved that you need to consult before you can employ some of these contingencies. And transactions always case by case in terms, again, whether you're going to employ 1, 2, 3 of the contingency expansions, just one, etc. So this is all, again, consulting with your buyer, how they want to write the offer, what makes sense, depending on, the competitive nature of the listing. Is there one other offer in, two other offers in, three other offers in? That might change how you're going to use this. And then just to show you where it's located, so I included this slide because you can see here in our zip forms global packets, they're right next to each other. If you hover over, you'll see that it's the one right next to the GMAR Addendum A. So it's right there, but it looks like it's the same document in our zip forms global packets. So just wanted to highlight that. All right, so getting into it, and before I start too, I'll say we're going to work backwards when we're doing this training today and start with the escalation clause and then move into the multiple offer, counter offer, excuse me, and then we'll hit the inspection threshold and the appraisal gap. So this should all look normal, typical to you guys. The addendum is made part of the offer to purchase dated. So you'll reference the date of the offer made by the buyer with respect to the property at, you'll put in the address there. And then I always like to highlight this too, the inclusion of the optional provisions. So it says here, and this is language that is also on the addendum A and the offer, I believe. Provisions preceded by an open box are part of this addendum if marked such as with an X. They are not part of the offer if marked with NA or left blank. We highly, highly encourage that if you are not going to include a contingency, that you are still marking it NA versus leaving it blank. We really want to demonstrate that we have gone over each section of the offer. And if anything were to come up post-closing, we can point back to this. And if there's ever any question, we can say this wasn't NA. There's no question. They don't want to include this provision. So just please be in the habit of that. All right, we'll get into it. So the escalation clause. So how it reads, and this is on the last page of the addendum A. So sorry, the addendum AC. If you're going to use it, you're going to again mark this with an X. And I'll just go over it line by line. If the seller accepts this offer and receives one or more additional bona fide offers to purchase the property with terms acceptable to the seller, no later than, and you're going to put in a date here. So this escalation clause is only going to apply to any offer that comes in before a certain time period. So that generally is going to mimic what the binding acceptance date is of the offer itself. But you could, move that date up if you wish, or yeah, you could move that date up if you wish. But again, typically you're just matching that date to what the binding acceptance day is of your offer, which will result in net proceeds of sale. So that's the purchase price minus any monetary contributions by the seller. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Payable to the seller equal to or greater than the net proceeds of sale payable to seller under this offer, then the purchase price of this offer shall automatically increase to an amount which generates net proceeds of sale to seller. Then you're going to put your incremental amount in here. So that could be $1,000, $2,500, $3,000 in excess of the highest net proceeds of sale generated in such other offers. The purchase price of this offer may be increased once, or your buyer may choose to increase it by more than once, based on one or more of the other offers. The purchase price of this offer shall not exceed, and then this is where you'll put in the buyer's max price. So again, in essence, the buyer is saying to the seller, I'm going to offer $200,000. But if any other offer comes in $200,000 or higher, I will beat that offer by $1,000 up to, we'll say $210,000. That is the spirit of the escalation clause. We've got our initial price. That's where the buyer's most comfortable at. But, if they're, again, in a competitive situation where, it might be bumped up much higher, they're saying to the seller, I'm willing to go up to a max price. But this is where I want to start. If the purchase price of this offer is increased based on one or more other offers, the seller shall, no later than, and it defaults to 2 days, after receipt of the other offers, submit to the buyer a signed amendment to the offer reflecting the adjusted purchase price and a copy of the other offer. Seller or their attorney shall send a bona fide other offer to the buyer's email address and then we're going to include our buyer's email address. The reason for this is now, so this language is stating that, okay, I'm willing to go up, by this incremental amount. But, Mr. Seller, I also want you to prove that to me. So I want to see a copy of the other offer before we amend the purchase price higher based on that other offer. And because we as agents have to adhere to confidentiality duties, excuse me, we need to deliver that other offer. Buyer and seller need to communicate that amongst each other. So that's why we are right off the bat including the buyer's email address. So in practice, we're accepting the offer. We're going to send the other offer that triggered the escalation clause. The seller is going to send that other offer to the buyer to prove that, yes, this got triggered. Buyer agrees to accept the amendment and deliver it back to the seller according to the delivery terms in this offer and by the deadline for acceptance in the amendment. So this language is really nice because it's stating right off the bat, buyer is agreeing to accept that amendment. We were running into issues prior to this language where it could be the case that the buyer decided, I said that we were going to increase the purchase price based off this other offer, but I'm not going to sign the amendment. So right now, currently, it states right in there, buyer and seller agree to execute that amendment based off of that other offer. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Gets even muddier. All right, so this is what Kimmy was highlighting in our team meeting last week. And, this was a variable that we did not need to consider prior to last August. After, now the adoption of our commissions being right included into the offer to purchase now, that commission is considered now a monetary contribution. So again, the way that the escalation clause reads, if the seller accepts this offer and receives one or more additional bona fide offers to purchase with terms acceptable to the seller, which result in net proceeds of sale, so that is the purchase price minus any monetary contribution by the seller. So, we're typically used to a monetary contribution being a closing cost credit. So, maybe there was a purchase price of $200,000 with a closing cost credit of $5,000. That would bring that net proceeds down to $195 technically. Now we need to make a consideration for the seller payment of compensation to the buyer's firm. So that's our commission. So not only are we taking the purchase price minus, that hypothetical closing cost credit, we also have to take the purchase price and deduct the seller payment of compensation. So that 2.4%, or maybe it's 2%. But that does now need to factor into our equation on whether or not the escalation clause will get triggered or not. So we just want to make sure that everyone is clear on that. Again, this is not something that we had to consider prior to last August. So we just really want to make sure that everyone is aware and operating under the same rules. Okay. Of choosing to exercise an escalation clause, the offer is simply accepted and evidence of the other offer is delivered to the buyer after an accepted offer. I'm kind of restating what I was saying a few minutes ago, but worth repeating. It is now clear that the seller's side initiates the amendment to change the price. So again, once the seller accepts that offer, they're going to send the other offer number 2 that triggered the escalation clause to the buyer so that the buyer can see that. Then the seller side is also going to initiate that amendment to change the purchase price. It is perfectly acceptable for the listing agent to deliver that amendment. It's just that the offer itself needs to be delivered between the seller and to the buyer. Stated right in the provision that the buyer must deliver the amendment back by the deadline again. So it's right in there, no question. And then just some notes here. So buyer's agents, in terms of using the escalation clause, these are just tips from us. So call the listing agent ahead of time before you're submitting the offer, before you're considering including an escalation clause and bringing it up to the buyer. The listing agent might say the seller doesn't want to entertain anything with an escalation clause. They might just want their highest and best. So just make sure that you are having these conversations with the listing agent. And then a tip for listing agents, at the time of listing the property or, having that conversation with your seller about what offer presentation is going to look like. Make sure that we are explaining an escalation clause, that we're comfortable with explaining it to our sellers. That's a big piece of this too. Sometimes a listing agent just may not be comfortable with them and might communicate to a buyer's agent, don't include them. But listing agents make sure that our sellers are comfortable with them too, and that it might be included in an offer if it's a hot property. Okay. Then quickly, we just wanted to go over the ability to bump more than once. So I'm going to go back. Oop, just excuse me. Sorry. Okay. My slideshow isn't going back. All right. Well, I can't get it to go, and that's just fine. So if you guys recall, um, it the provision allows for the price to escalate more than once. And the buyer can choose whether or not they only want their incremental amount to go up more than once and then leave it at that. Or they can play off of one another and the incremental amount can bump up more than once based off of other offers. So just wanted to kind of go through a very simple example of what that looks like. So let's say we've got an offer number one with an initial price of 160 with an escalation clause of 10,000 and it only bumps once and it goes up to a max price of 190. Offer number two, we've got an initial price of 167.5 with an escalation clause of 5,000 and it can bump more than once and the max price is 185. So to analyze this, the analysis looks like offer number one can turn into a potential purchase price of 177.5 because you're taking that $10,000 increment and you're adding it to the 167.5 of offer number two. Offer number two now may add $5,000 to that 177.5 for offer number one for a final purchase price of 182.5. And that's because this offer number two indicated that the offer may be bumped more than once. So this is a kind of a simple example, but you can see how it can get kind of muddy, kind of hard to calculate when we've got multiple offers with the ability to bump more than once. So just beware. All right, more reminders. So listing agents, just again, caution to be extra vigilant when reviewing the offers with an escalation clause. And this is where we're going to get into the multiple counter offer and remind everyone about the use of this. So both the WRE attorneys and our KW legal counsel have advised us that in these situations where where a seller receives multiple offers with multiple escalation clauses, that sellers are better served using a counter offer, either identifying one party that they might want to pursue, or using the multiple counter offer and countering multiple buyers. So a multiple counter can address other terms of the offer as well that the seller wishes to see different. I think that's one thing that a lot of listing agents kind of forget about is that, just because we have these offers with these escalation clauses, there might be other terms within these offers that is not as favorable to a seller. So it might not be the case where you just want to, where it's a slam dunk, you want to accept that offer with the escalation clause, because there might be other terms in there that you want to counter anyway. So it might just be the seller's best interest to counter it. And then with that multiple counter offer, it's kind of nice how these work. The seller, depending on how the negotiations go, might have the opportunity to choose from multiple offers with the most terms favorable to them. So let's go through how that works. So again, you're going to use this when you are going to counter more than one buyer. It would be unethical for an agent to use a multiple counter form if they are not actually countering more than one offer. And we've run into that. So just want to be, listing agent beware. It's not a negotiation tactic or a strategy to make the other party think that there's more than one offer when there's not. So again, you would need to for sure have more than one offer in order to use the multiple counter, and that you are actually countering the other buyers as well. In the case of an accelerator clause, so this clarifies the purchase price. There's no math that we need to work out. You're going to identify a price that the seller wants to see, and you're going to write that in the terms of the counteroffer. And then it's crystal clear, and there's no question. And it eliminates the need for proof of that other offer as well. And there are three parts to a multiple counter.
And just quickly, for those, if anybody here is like brand new, accelerator clause and escalation clause are the same thing. They're kind of used interchangeably. So just a note on that.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the multiple counter proposal. Okay, so again, you're going to be using this if there's more than one offer that you are countering. And it says right there on line 1, a multiple counter proposal is being made by the seller to one or more other prospective buyers. The term of this multiple counter proposal may differ from the terms of multiple counter proposals being submitted to other prospective buyers. This multiple counter is not binding on seller or buyer until seller's binding acceptance per lines 40 to 42. Seller or buyer may withdraw their multiple counter proposal or accepted multiple counter proposal at any time prior to the binding acceptance on line 40 to 42. The offer to purchase dated, so you're going to put there May 18th and signed by, again, the buyer. So this is just like a counter offer for the purchase of the real estate, and then you're going to identify the address. Is rejected and the following multiple counter proposal is made. All terms and conditions remain the same as stated in the offer, except the following. And then again, you're just going to propose the terms that the seller wants to see differently about that first offer. So maybe we're changing purchase price, the closing date is changed, the inspection deadline is extended, etc. Whatever the seller wants to see. And then a note here too, the terms may look different depending on the offer, of course. So, you know, depending on what offer number 1 says and what their additional terms are, it's going to be different from what we might be countering on offer number 2 and offer number 3, etc. They don't all have to look identical. We've gotten that question before too.
Yeah, I will say from like the listing agent side, or I'm sorry, the buyer's agent side, we've always talked about when you're using the escalation clause, you are kind of showing your buyer's hands of what is the
Mhm.
price that they're willing to go up to. They essentially state that in the escalation clause. And so one buyer might say, I'm willing to go up to 190, another buyer might say 180. So you might use that information to depending on what your purchase price is that you're countering at.
Yes. Um, okay, going down to lines 19 to 23. Um, so this is where let's see here. The multiple counter proposal by the seller will expire and be null and void unless approved by the buyer and is delivered to the seller in a manner authorized in the purchase on or before blank. So what you're identifying there is that the seller has sent out this counter. The buyer must approve that uh, counter or counter it themselves on or before this date. So we're identifying 2 dates in this. This first one is when the buyer has to send that approved counteroffer back to the seller. And then on line 22, just you're going to identify you yourself as the listing agent as drafting that multiple counter proposal. On lines 25 through 26, your sellers are going to sign there. Okay. Then, so the next step is the buyer has the option to approve what has been sent to them, what has been proposed to them, or they have the ability to counter this multiple counter offer as well. So on line 28, multiple counter proposal by seller is approved by the buyer. Approval of this multiple counter proposal is not binding on the buyer or the seller until binding acceptance of this approved multiple counter proposal by the seller, excuse me, on lines 40 to 42 on or before May 20th. So um, this is where it gets kind of weird. So the approval by the buyer does not mean there is an accepted offer yet. Um, but it's not binding upon both parties until that seller accepts the buyer's approval on this date, on or before that date. So we've got two dates, like I've said. We've got the date that the seller has to, or that the buyer has to approve it and then send it back to the seller. And then it's binding acceptance once the seller signs and accepts their approval and sends it back to the buyer by this May 20th date, or whatever date is identified by the seller. So, um, I also want to point out here again that if the buyer does not want to accept those terms or, excuse me, approve those terms as they are, then they have the ability to counter this as well. And you would just use the WB 44 regular counteroffer to change the terms that the buyer wants to see. So I'll say here, it might be, a savvy buyer's agent might give the advice to the buyer, well, let's improve those terms even more so. I've had buyer's agents, buyers, increase that purchase price by yet even more than what the seller had suggested. And that's to kind of make their counter offer stand out even more. So just, we kind of talk about strategy sometimes in these trainings, so that's just a note there, that it might behoove you to use that strategy. All right, third part. So it's officially accepted once the seller signs and delivers back to the buyer by the date identified on that line 30. So they're going to sign here. The seller, excuse me, is going to sign here on 45, 46, and then send it back to the buyer that prevailed, and now it's fully accepted. So again, in practice, if you think, maybe there's three multiple counteroffers that have been sent out. Let's say each buyer approves each one of those. So then we're going to get three approvals back. And now the seller gets to pick which one they want from those three, send it back to the winning buyer, and then you've got an accepted offer. So you can see how it's very nice for a seller if they were able to, have the pick of the litter. So, but then the flip side of that too, again, is if you are doing a counter, remember, that buyer does have the option to not accept it at all or approve it at all. Any questions so far? Okay, everyone's with us still. Good. Okay. Again, we wanted to kind of go that multiple counter offer. I don't know that we've ever had an official training on the multiple counter offer. And excuse me, there's an ambulance going past right now, so I think it's gone. So again, we wanted to highlight, that for the bigger masses as well. A lot of, our seasoned agents, it is kind of weird and tricky, so we wanted to make sure that you guys had an understanding of the multiple counter offer as well. Okay, before we move on, we're going to do one more example in terms of how, just kind of again beware of this fact that we need to use our commission now as a monetary contribution as it relates to calculating what a purchase price is going to be. So we're going to go through this example. This was actually written by our attorney. And, he says right here too, this is verbatim from him. This is why I think sellers are better served using counter offers. So we'll go through it just so you guys can get an example. So buyer makes a $500,000 offer with an escalation clause of 2,500 up to 525 using standard language that deducts monetary contributions of other bona fide offers. Okay. So their offer includes a payment of a commission of 2.4%. So without the escalation, their offer nets the seller 488 after the payment of that commission. So that first offer number one is technically netting the seller 488. Seller receives a second offer of 512.5 with a payment of 2.4%. The seller thinks this will escalate the other offer to 515 and sends the offer to the buyer to trigger the escalation. Buyer argues that the second offer cannot be used at all. The net price of the second offer after deducting the commission as a monetary contribution is only $499,687.50. So that is not equal to or greater than the net proceeds of this offer. And so the seller cannot even exercise the escalation clause at all because it was not a triggering number. And he says here the buyer may be correct. So, what we want to highlight here is just the potential for these disagreements. And so again, just using a counter offer to really clarify what that purchase price is going to be, or again, in the case, it may be that you're using multiple counters, is just going to avoid any confusion and problems with the escalation clauses altogether. So they have their place, and with the adoption of, including the commission right into the offer, it's really kind of muddied things up. So, and it trips up everybody. So I want everyone to have peace of mind too. It's not, if you're not mathing it and not calculating it, if there's confusion, it's because it's confusing. And it's confusing for everybody. So let's just clear it up.
Good question. If you can go back to that last slide, please.
Hopefully I can. Annie?
And my question is just the buyer may be correct. If the second offer did pay the 2.4%, then that buyer is correct.
Yeah. I mean,
So we have to include the buyer compensation commission in that price.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. No.
Okay.
No, I mean, good eye. Like you're right. I mean, I think it's, when our attorney is conversationally speaking with us and like, when we've got questions about this and he's like, the buyer might be right, I think that's how I would read that versus, but you're right. Like the buyer probably is correct here. Buyer is correct.
Because if that is the case, I want to, I assume that I'm like most people is whenever I'm have a listing, I have an Excel sheet that I've created that the top part of the Excel sheet is all the different parts of the offer. And the
Yeah.
bottom part is the net of what goes to the seller. I need to, when I'm figuring that out, of making sure that I'm using the correct number that would bounce the accelerator clause if I was using that.
Yes. So as the seller, as the listing agent, then you are the one who needs to be super mindful, obviously. And you're not having an understanding that you're triggering an escalation clause when you're not. So, um,
I think there's also some situations when we've kind of played around with some of the math in these discussions where, seller has multiple offers with escalation clauses, but then when you're factoring in the compensation to the buyer's agent, gosh, I just totally just lost my train of thought. I think just that the seller is better off sometimes just accepting that one of the offers without even including that escalation clause. So that initial price of, let's say,
oh yes,
5 is going to ultimately net the seller more than actually triggering their escalation clause, if that makes sense. So there's just
yes,
a lot of, because every escalation clause can be tweaked a little bit differently. So they all can ultimately give a different net price, which again, going back to the point is that as the listing agent, you have to be super vigilant in reviewing everything and okay, what is the outcome of this if we trigger the escalation, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and Annie, you made a like just commenting on your seller net proceed sheets, just like making sure that we're all um practicing and have our estimated net proceeds sheets, you know? So um and that we are using those and with calculating all of these. Um so okay. I think I'm gonna skip over the next example. It's actually an example, another one with three different offers. This is actually an example that I pulled from a training that Carol Krigbaum did. But I think we've made our point. So, okay. How are we doing, everybody? Hope we're doing good. Okay, let's move on. So this is the inspection threshold language. This is actually the first contingency on the GMAR Addendum AC. The spirit of this, like to speak in terms of that, versus like going line by line, but we will. Spirit of this is that a buyer is communicating to a seller, I want an inspection contingency to protect myself so that I know, what's going on with the home. It's really scary to go into a home without having an inspection done, obviously. But to, knowing that I might be in competition, I'm going to communicate to you, Mr. Seller, that I'm going to identify an amount that I'm not going to ask you or attempt to negotiate with you on anything over, on any repairs under a certain amount. So let's say there are $5,000 worth of repairs, and I'm telling you I won't negotiate on anything under 5,000, then we'll just proceed and I will take on that $5,000 myself. If that number exceeds that threshold amount, though, as we are doing our due diligence during our inspection period, if I learn that there are repairs that are total, that are in excess of that threshold amount, then it does open up negotiation for me. So let's just go through it, how it reads. So the buyer agrees not to submit any notice of defects or amendment for repairs, replacement, credit, or price reduction under this inspection contingency in the offer, unless the cumulative estimated cost to repair or replace the defects identified in the inspection exceeds a certain amount. So this could be, again, this is going to be a conversation with the buyer. $5,000, $10,000. We've seen $15,000, probably more than that in the higher priced homes. So if the seller has the right to cure defects. So that means too that the inspection contingency that is written into the main offer, so the WB11, one caveat here is that the seller has to have been given the right to cure in that inspection contingency. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to use this. So if the buyer delivers a notice of defects, the seller's election to cure applies only to the balance of the items for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace exceeds the amount stated on line 10. So it has to get to that point where a notice of defects is served and the seller elects to cure, then the buyer is going to be committing to paying that first identified amount, that first $5,000 of repairs, that first $10,000 of repairs, etc. Moving on, so the estimate of the cost for repair or replacement shall be obtained from independent qualified professionals or contractors selected by the buyer. The seller agrees to provide access for the buyer and buyer's qualified professionals or contractors to obtain the estimates. So this is all laid out right in here. So there is no confusion that they're, heading off any arguments about whether or not we can allow a contractor in. The buyer shall pay any costs associated with obtaining those estimates. So again, setting the expectation for the buyer when you're going over this, just like you are with the inspection contingency. If there are follow-up inspections needed based off of the recommendation from your general home inspector, you, Mr. Buyer, are committing to paying for those estimates. The parties may together agree on the cost to repair or replace the defects for purposes of this provision. The estimates obtained or agreed upon are utilized only for execution of this provision and do not affect any seller right to cure unless specifically agreed in writing. One or more of the following provisions may be included if checked. And I think these are really nice. So if the buyer chooses to, they can allow the seller to obtain their own estimates. And the seller can retrieve those estimates and deliver to the buyer by the deadline for the inspection contingency, as long as a notice of defects has not already been served. So if the buyer does serve a notice of defects prior to that seller obtaining their own estimates, then the seller's estimates are just not in play. If the seller timely delivers such estimates and the estimates differ from the buyer's estimates for the same items, the parties agree, and it's right out, spelled out right here too. Parties agree they will average the different estimates for each affected item to arrive at the cost for purposes of this provision. They really were trying to head off as many potential issues as possible. You can see. Line 25, this is nice too. So if the buyer chooses to mark this, he is saying that either party may extend the original deadline for the inspection contingency by a set amount of days, it's 5 if it's left blank, to allow for follow-up inspections and or obtaining estimates. So either party may do this by delivering a written notice of extension if delivered to the other party prior to expiration of the original deadline for the inspection contingency. So that's kind of nice. So, normally both parties would have to agree to extend the inspection contingency. But if we do need more days to allow for follow-up inspections or getting more estimates, just buyer or seller can unilaterally say to the other side, we need more time. So here's a written notice of extension. We're automatically going to extend this inspection contingency by 5 days. So, just some more notes. So line 9 uses the cumulative and adds an S to the word defect. So therefore it can be used for one or more. So if one item is above the number on line 10, the notice could be given. Or if all individual items add up to the number identified on line 10, the notice or the amendment could be sent. So there was some confusion about this, whether that threshold number applied to each certain defect. It doesn't. It could be one or it could be all of them. And again, in essence here, buyer is agreeing not to send a notice or an amendment if total costs fall under that threshold amount. So they cannot deliver a notice of defects, and they cannot even attempt to negotiate with a seller if it falls under that threshold. And then this is kind of, I feel like this is where a lot of people get tripped up in terms of negotiating. So if the seller elects to cure, seller will only be responsible for the cost to cure the defect or the defects over the threshold on line 10. So an extension of this is that if that amount gets over that threshold, the buyer does have the ability to attempt to negotiate on all of it. So once we get over that threshold amount, it's not, unless a notice of defects is served, the buyer is not technically committing to paying that first $5,000 or whatever the case may be in a negotiation standpoint. From the perspective of doing amendments and coming to a conclusion on what's going to happen with these repairs, it's not set in stone that the buyer is saying, I'll take on the first 5,000. So I just want We run into that question a lot, and it kind of goes against the spirit of it, in a sense, but really that $5,000 threshold number only applies technically, once a notice of defects is served, and that the seller elects to cure. Then the buyer is for sure on the hook for that threshold amount that they have identified. So it's kind of interesting. So, 9 times out of 10, I think what's happening with negotiations is that, buyer will still commit to paying that up to that threshold amount. And then you guys are still coming to a meeting of the minds, getting an amendment executed and moving to closing. But it's technically not the case. Like once you get over that threshold amount, all bets are off and buyer and seller can come to whatever agreement they want to. And I liked this. I included this we had a lot of questions, obviously, when this first came out. And so just a way that Corey Lamont, who drafted this, drafted the Addendum AC, she said, so the language is intended to say that if a buyer includes that $5,000 on line 10 and then provides a notice of defects for 10,000, the seller is only on the hook to cure 5,000. The buyer has basically said, I am good to cover 5,000. Anything above that, seller, I am saying I need you to cover. So again, that's just kind of a repeat of what we said, but it came straight from Corey. So we like to include anything she says. Okay, any questions? It's a lot. Okay. All right, well, the final one, which is the most simple, is the appraisal gap language. This is a little bit more straightforward. This, again, the kind of the spirit of this is the buyer puts in a great offer. Maybe it's like way over asking. And a seller has a concern that it's not going to appraise out. They've got an appraisal contingency. They still need to write with an appraisal contingency. The buyer is communicating to the seller now with this appraisal gap language. Okay, I'm going to pay $299 or I'm going to pay $300,000 for this house. If it appraises at lower than that, I am good to cover a certain amount up to my comfort level. So I will put in a gap of $5,000. So if it appraises at 294 and above, I'm still good to pay that $300,000. If the appraised value comes in below that gap, then it opens up more options. So line 29, if the offer includes an appraisal contingency and the appraised value is less than the purchase price, the buyer agrees to cover the difference up to, and then you're going to name that amount. So again, it could be $5,000, it could be $10,000, it could be $15,000. Buyer hereby, and we have this highlighted, buyer hereby represents the buyer has sufficient funds to cover the gap and amount financed in the financing commitment contingency in the offer. So, back in one of our first slides, I said you might need to consult with a lender. So on some of these extensions, this is the example of that. So we need to make sure, like, yes, the buyer has said they can do a $5,000 gap, a $10,000 gap, but can they really? So the buyer is saying, representing within this offer, yes, I do have sufficient funds to do that. I'm not just saying that. So we need to make sure we're having conversations with our lenders as buyer's agents. We're considering putting this appraisal gap language in the offer. Can they do that? And up to what amount? So your lender will help you identify what that amount could be. Buyer is hereby prohibited from sending a notice objecting to the appraised value unless the appraised value is lower than the purchase price minus the appraisal gap. So that buyer can't send a notice objecting to the appraised value if it falls between that gap price. again, if it comes in, back to my example, if we have a $300,000 purchase price and the appraisal gap is 5,000 and the appraised value comes in at 290, then yes, the buyer can send over that notice objecting to the appraised value. If the seller has the right to cure the appraisal contingency in the offer, the seller may satisfy the contingency by delivering written notice to the buyer, adjusting the purchase price to the value shown on the appraisal report plus the appraisal gap. So that's actually already built in here. So let's say, again, $300,000 purchase price, $5,000 gap, and a 290 appraised value. Then if that buyer serves a notice objecting to the appraised value and the seller has the right to cure, the seller can cure it and then add that $5,000 gap. So then the purchase price becomes $295. I do want to say here too, again, there's always, and this is true of the inspection contingency, obviously, before a notice of defects is sent or a notice of a objection to the appraised value, the buyer and seller do have an opportunity to negotiate as they normally would before it gets to that notice point. So buyer and seller could come to a different number if they wanted to. I think that's it. I think we're good. Any questions? It's a lot.
Wondering if anybody has had to argue or, inform the other agent about how that inspection contingency works. Because I've been in that situation where they didn't understand it the way we understand it, and
Sure.
so
Well, that kind of goes back to our point before about how there's different interpretations of how the language reads. And that's always going to be, an issue with any agent who might not have a super clear understanding of any language that's written in these contracts. So, but yeah, Leah, I mean, if I would, as a buyer's agent, you're going to obviously want to take the extra step to like, okay, this is what this means. And, we want to make sure that the seller is of full understanding so that you're explaining it right to your seller. So, and I think that's like, again, that could be true of any point that you want to make sure is coming across clearly so that the seller has an understanding of what exactly the buyer's intentions are. Any other questions? Okay, biggest takeaway, multiple counter proposal. And use those. All right, next week we don't have contract training because it's Memorial Day. So we will be back in action in June, and I don't know if we have our contract topics set up yet, but those will be on the calendar shortly.
Oh, I did see just a quick question in the chat. How
Oh.
often are you seeing the addendum AC currently being used? I'm seeing it used fairly often, either with the inspection gap or the appraisal gap. I see either of those used fairly frequently, and I would say typically $5,000 is the number I see for the inspection gap, but I mean, I've seen much bigger amounts too. I saw an appraisal contingency gap, $120,000 gap. I mean, that was like an offer that was written $100,000 over asking. So I've seen some crazy things, but I do see addendum AC used quite often.
Yeah.
More often than not, I would say.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And another thing too, like just in talking about like competitive offer writing, I mean, I'm sure Kimmy too, you've seen just like even more creative like provisions that a buyer could include in competitive offer writing. So, just as a buyer's agent, just know that there are other tools you can use too. So,
Yeah, the largest takeaway on that is talking to the lender first before offering some of these creative concessions to the seller.
True.
because the lender may not approve your loan.
Yeah.
that kind
And
of-
two, on this listing side too, if you're getting a bunch of offers and you're seeing maybe some crazy terms with the appraisal gap or even the purchase price, don't be afraid to call that. Hopefully they're attaching a pre-approval letter. Don't be afraid to call their buyer's lender and
Oh, yeah.
verify, hey, we got this offer. Are these terms acceptable? And
Yeah, I mean, we saw over the weekend, Kimmy, right? Like a too good to be true offer that was, and our agent was incredible with, doing her homework and calling the lender ahead of time and making sure that the buyer was vetted. So no, yeah, what Kimmy said, like that's an option for you. So okay. Any other parting words, Kimmy or Joan?
Good job, Steph.
yeah.
Not. Okay. All
Thanks,
right.
Steph.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.